Good morning. What does it mean to be more equitable in resource allocation? How are philanthropists changing their practices to ensure that all communities have access to the resources that they need? Today, we're discussing equitable practices in philanthropy and the important role that philanthropists play in responding to the needs of underserved communities. I'm Peta Blakely. I am the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting, and this is Coffee Time with Masterminds, a 30-minute show in which we talk to leaders of mission-based organizations about managing through times of uncertainty. I'm joined by my co-host, Rebecca Tuttle. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Peta. How are you?
Good, thank you. So, Rebecca, you work with a lot of organizations that are raising money and with a lot of philanthropists and philanthropic organizations. What are you seeing? Are there changes happening?
There's a lot of changes happening. And I don't know if in this scenario, this only scenario, if COVID was a blessing and a curse, obviously the illness part is the curse, but the blessing has been that there has been so much more charitable giving and philanthropic resource allocation than ever before. And it's expanded into so many different areas so that these smaller organizations who maybe didn't have that record of success could then enter into consideration for funding. So I'm really pleased with what we've seen in philanthropy. I think it's amazing.
One of the things that I think we've seen is that philanthropists have been allowing a lot more flexibility and reducing some of the barriers to accessing funds.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we mean when we talk about equity and philanthropy, making the process more simplified so that everyone can understand it. And if they don't understand it, then they're able to access the information that they need to, really gather an understanding of the application process and all of that. And I also think that they have foregone a lot of restrictions that were there before so that they could open it up to some other organizations. And an example is a lot of times when you look through the funders' eligibility, you'll see that they do not support faith-based organizations. But a lot of us have been going to more of the community organizations because the doors have closed for some nonprofits in the community because of COVID. And so they have opened up their charitable giving to allow for some of those faith-based organizations. That's just one example.
That's really great. Do you think that is, increasing impact on the ground?
I think so, because you have to remember, there's more to faith-based organizations than going to church and sitting in prayer on a Sunday or whenever you practice. Churches have historically been and remained, my understanding in the communities that I'm familiar with, they open their doors to people when there's a lot of doors shutting on you. So they can help connect you with parishioners or members of the community through donations. They oftentimes will house soup kitchens and community kitchens. They oftentimes will open up and offer you the space to use for your nonprofit to do your programming. So there's a lot that can happen in a faith-based organization as the site itself. And I think philanthropists are realizing that because as we've closed a lot of doors from the COVID pandemic, a lot of nonprofits had to maneuver to places that were open or at least accessible. And that's why I think or suspect that they have opened up to faith-based organizations.
So this is creating a lot of new opportunities for especially smaller not-for-profits. What are some caveats for those small not-for-profits?
Well, I had mentioned that it opens up opportunities. So if you didn't have, take for example, I'm working with a client now. They've never received a grant in their entire, tenure, but they are more than capable of applying for grants and securing and managing that funding. And what they have is a record of community traction and community support, but they also have a record of direct donations. So if their cause resonates with me and then I give a gift directly to that organization, I think we're seeing that what's the difference between managing donor funds and managing grant funds? You're still appealing to the donor, respecting that process and reporting back out to the donor as you would very similarly in maybe a smaller grant proposal. So, and then you also use direct donation to leverage opportunity in grant writing.
Mhm.
So, I think that it's putting a lot of smaller organizations on the map where they belong.
I think, the reporting thing is hard. That's something that I see in my work, that when organizations start to get grants, any grant, but especially bigger or more sophisticated funding than they're used to, the evaluation and reporting requirements can be hard to manage.
Mm-hmm. They
Yeah.
can, but you know what? The benefit of the smaller nonprofit with all those donations versus the one who maybe relies the majority of their revenue comes from grants. Oftentimes grants will restrict those services that you just mentioned, your services, and your services and expertise are what's going to help that organization get into better touch, better community understanding of the need in their community. And it's going to help set them up for success with what data should we capture? How do we capture it? How do we articulate that back out? Which, if they do all of that, will make them more competitive in the grant space.
Yeah.
But the caveat here is grants don't necessarily allow for those services to be, let's say, paid for through
Yep.
that grant. Whereas if you had direct unrestricted donations, you could apply for a grant and you could also use those donations to hire someone like you. So they are at a disadvantage when you rely too much on grants, and you're more of an advantage when you maybe don't have so much experience with grants, but you have that direct donor support.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important thing that I think some small organizations don't realize is that grants come with overhead. Not
Absolutely.
all of the money, some of the small organizations are used to just pouring every penny that they have into direct service. And when you start to raise more money, you start to have to build up internal systems that are a little bit more sophisticated. And evaluation is part of that. There's often hurdles around financial reporting, and you're going to start to need more sophisticated bookkeeping and financial management. So how are funders helping these small nonprofits do that? Because I think the capacity building piece is important.
That's a great question. So along that line too is a lot of organizations that are smaller, they don't have the strategic plan either. So that's where that capacity building piece comes in. Applying for capacity building funds to see what's feasible, what's realistic for our organization, and then helping to build some of that strategic planning component, and also to take a look at, where are we going as an organization? How can we grow responsibly? And capacity building is absolutely essential to help you with that. But, it's really interesting because that also causes a lot of fear for organizations. And that's where they say, well, that's where you hear things like, well, we've never done this before, or, we really don't have the capacity, right, to do that. So I think that before you jump into the more sophisticated grants with the more sophisticated data and evaluation and reporting, you should focus first on what's your capacity as an organization. Even if it's just, as Cynthia does these a lot, right, board retreats to start the dialogue there for some of those conversations. And funders will fund those conversations.
That is really good to know, that funders can help fund that and build in that capacity, because some smaller organizations might just be saying, we're not going to go after those kinds of funds. We don't want to, we don't want to have to build that up, or we don't have capacity to implement those processes.
And where you run into more of a challenge is when you're applying for municipal funding or state or even federal funding. But Grants.gov is a great resource for federal funding. That's where it's all housed. They have an entire Grants 101 program that you can go through that will teach you. We have education programs here, but they'll teach you how to apply for those federal funds. And you can apply that same knowledge to private foundation funding opportunities, as well as state and municipal. So wherever you can learn the skill, you're going to be better off and better prepared for when you do get to that next level of application.
Yeah, that's really great to know. And what would you recommend to smaller organizations that are thinking about going after grants? Where do they start?
Well, I mean, consulting helps, right? To put a plug in there.
Should they go after local, regional, right? Yeah.
I think just talking about their mission. I tell my clients and students all the time. We've talked about it on the show. Talk about your mission as though it's the most exciting thing in the whole wide world. Everywhere you go, with everyone you meet, have your mission-minded conversation with people. Let them know, here's who we are and what we do and how we help the community. And what happens is, if you're not really ready yet to apply for funding, then you're going to have a conversation with someone who says, wow, that's really great. Tell me more about your work and your mission. I know another organization, or I know someone who is giving out grants or sits on a board. So it's really relationship building that is the opening of the door to philanthropy and to charitable giving. So talk about your mission everywhere you go, with everyone, as though you're excited. It's when
of course you are excited.
Right, you are excited. You should be, right? It's when we talk about our mission and there's always an ask that turns people off, right? So talk about it, live it, breathe it, be excited about it. Let people know that people in our community are relying on our organization. Here's how we help. Would you love to, we'd love to have you get more involved. Sometimes that's all it takes.
Yeah. That's great advice. And say again the website where people can learn more about applying for grants. Is it Grants 101?
It's Grants 101 on grants.gov. So it's the federal government's grant website. Mm-hmm.
That's great for people to know about. Yeah.
And I always say, book off an hour a day for a week and you'll get through their tutorial. Watch what's relevant to you. The other thing to note is some of the things that hinder organizations from applying for grants is they don't have tax ID number assigned. They don't have a DUNS number assigned. So there are components other than eligibility that are required for you if you need a certain certification that you have to get in place as an organization before you can even go ahead and apply. And so what are the delays with that? It could be 30, 60, 90 days there. So really figuring out what it entails to be an applicant is just as important as what is our capacity as an organization.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've talked about on this show is, right sizing grant applications and going after. You've talked about how you don't want to get a huge grant one year and then actually see your budget shrinking the next year. So it seems like federal grants are probably not where organizations should start, but something to work up to.
I don't think an organization should start at the federal level unless you are invited or encouraged. Oftentimes you'll see congressional leaders or stakeholders will reach out to organizations and help you through the process, but they are very difficult. We just submitted last Friday $10 million in federal funding, and we worked on those grants for over 2 months. And there was a whole team. So that, when I say sophistication, it isn't because you can't handle it. It's because there are so many intricacies and it is very difficult. So start with the smaller opportunities. Start with that community conversation level and then work your way up there. Or what you could do to introduce yourself, and we do this a lot in business when we're going after procurement opportunities with the state and federal government, is you partner with an organization as a collaboration and they are the lead applicant and they write you in, that's a nice introduction to the process and the expectation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of organizations don't realize how hard it is to manage a federal grant. I mean, getting it is sometimes the easy part, but it takes significant staff just to have it, to do your reporting, to do your financial reporting. You're looking at 3 or 4 people who aren't delivering the service, that are just managing the grant itself, and that's a hurdle. Yeah.
And oftentimes you have to hire a third-party evaluator, such as yourself. So do you want to talk about the role you play in federal funding? I think that would be a nice segue.
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't realize that it's not always proportionate, but generally, federal grants will have fairly high requirements for reporting. And the reason is simple. The funding agency needs to make the case to Congress that they've been effective with that money. Remember that money is taxpayer money. So
right.
They justify its use, right? It's our money as citizens and taxpayers. And so it's reasonable and right that they want to know that they're, affecting change, right? Causing the change that they want in the world. And so one of the ways that they do that is that they'll make grants into several organizations and several communities, and then they want to aggregate that up to show the effect that they're having at the level of the country, because that's what the federal government is responsible for. And so that's why they're going to be like a little prescriptive about what you report, and a little demanding compared to some funders. And it can be a big lift. You might have to survey your entire neighborhood. You're going to have to report maybe more frequently than you do for other programs. It's going to require a lot of rigor in terms of target setting and the quality of your calculations and reporting. It's well worth it. I mean, this is how every organization should be thinking about their work, but the scale of it is huge, right? And
it is huge.
Done it before. It's a lot. Yeah.
But think about it this way. They are actually using organizations, just like everyone, who's joining us today. They're using your organization to demonstrate community impact. So you then become part of reliable research. You are research, which I think is very impressive for, to be able to be a participant in that. It lends credibility to your organization and to your teams who did the work, right? Not just the grant writing piece and the management, but the people who are doing the visits and serving the direct service. It really lends tremendous kudos, if you will, to the organization. And I love that you brought that up, because that's how that's one of the ways that our government and our decision makers create research. And it's funny because we use some of that research in our federal grant writing. So it really goes full circle. We're pulling from that information to get more funding, which is great.
And that's so important, that when you're doing that kind of evaluation work or contributing to an evaluation, you're helping make the case that this sort of program in general works and is effective. And you're leaving behind tips and best practices for other organizations that might want to do similar work. So it's really a way of expanding your impact. And it's very important. I tell organizations and people who are doing the work all the time, evaluation is an ethical obligation. And one of the reasons it's an ethical obligation is that now that you've tried this thing, you have a responsibility to let the next organization know what worked and what didn't work, right? This process should go better and better as we do it more and more. And so, these kinds of federal reporting requirements are a way that you help make that information available to the field. And that's really
And
important.
to bring solution to the community, because you could set out, and I'm sure you know this very well, PETA,
Mhm.
can attest to this, very well, is you set out to measure one thing and you make
Yep.
assumptions about your community in your logic model. That's part of the
Mhm.
process. What do we know
Yep.
to be true? And then you find something else out completely different. And what if your organization cannot handle that response? What do you
Right.
do? Well, that's all the more reason why you have to share back out your findings and bring in people to fill in those gaps in need, because otherwise you literally just leave people hanging, and we don't want to
Right.
do that.
Yeah.
So how are you advancing equity in your work? Because we're talking today about how difficult this is,
Yeah.
how limited it is. Some organizations don't have that capacity. How are you advancing equity in your work, PETA?
That's a great question. And I think there are several ways to think about equity here. One is equity in access. When we set out to serve a community, are we actually serving everybody in that community? And that can mean, can people physically get to the resource, or are we delivering the resource where it needs to be delivered? In the languages it needs to be delivered, in culturally responsive and appropriate ways. Those are all equity issues. Are we in any way signaling that anybody is not welcome here? In the way that we're messaging, in the way that we're sharing our information. And are we attending to equity in our reporting? Are we holding ourselves accountable and saying, to measure, is everybody here who should be at the table? And are people being included and those voices being heard in our delivery? So I think that's very important. We have a little bit more flexibility, for those reasons that you said, that funders are really trusting organizations at the grassroots level to deliver the services that communities need. And so we have this opportunity to be a little bit more creative with our service delivery and with our reporting, and create changes that will stay in these organizations, right? I think at the beginning of COVID, a lot of funders were like, we don't really know what to do here. We're just going to send, community
Emergency relief, and you tell us what that
you
means.
tell us what to do with it, right? Which is fantastic, but then it really means you've got this responsibility to report back. Here's what we did, and here's what worked.
Right, and it wasn't just to save salaries either.
Right.
That money was meant to really go to the people in the community who need it. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, where you're going to see those dips. And especially if people use those funds to bring on new staff, bring on new team members. If you're not doing disaster planning right now for next year, then I don't know. That's why this work is so important. That's why capacity conversations are so important right now.
Yeah. Yep. And I think, in this coming federal administration, that we are going to see a lot of funding going directly to community-based organizations. We saw a lot of that in the Obama administration, and so I think that we're going to see it in the Biden administration. And that is, it's a blessing and a curse. So It's a fantastic opportunity to get a lot of money directly into communities, and get it administered by the organizations that know those communities best and know their needs best. It is a tremendous strain on a small community-based organization when they suddenly get this flood of funding and federal attention.
Right, and that's, it all goes back to the planning is, just because there's money there doesn't mean a couple things. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily a right fit for you. It could be that it's not a right fit for you right now due to limitations or capacity, all of those things. Or maybe your organization isn't the best to respond to that opportunity. Maybe you should partner with others who can. So we also, as organizations who are funded, we have a tremendous responsibility, a social and ethical responsibility to really be transparent in our reporting back to philanthropists, because they rely on the organizations that they fund to understand that bigger picture. And if you're not transparent in that communication back to the funder, then because funders are making it a point, so much so now, we talked about, leave the suits at home. I want to be part of the community. They're going to see it for themselves. And if your messaging and what they're seeing and hearing doesn't align, then that's not really a good thing, right?
Right.
And social media has also allowed for more access to philanthropists, to check out those that they are funding. So,
That's interesting.
I think we're pushing transparency, and I wish we did it sooner, but now that it's here, we have to keep doing it, because that's what's going to open the doors and make philanthropy more equitable for all.
Yeah. I think, one last point to make is about sustainability. You've talked a lot about fundraising as, about having a coherent fundraising and development plan. And one of the things about larger funding sources is you might have to try a couple of times, and you're probably going to have to plan a little bit further in advance. This is the time to be thinking about long-term planning, even though it seems like we're reacting. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you are delivering a service now that goes away next year.
Right, and that's part of that disaster planning I was talking about. You're right.
Yeah. Yeah. So Rebecca, what's the big takeaway right now?
I think the big takeaway is, don't be afraid to explore funding, but also be responsible and prepare yourself for that responsibility, because it is a tremendous responsibility. And if you need help, reach out to other organizations who are doing it and doing it well. Reach out to people who can mentor you there. And don't ever think for a moment that just because you're small, that you're not mighty, that you can't handle it. It's just really a matter of, what do you need to get into place to be able to do that? Because I have seen organizations, and I've worked with them from the ground up. They have no funding, or maybe they have $500 in their account, to ones that are multi-million organizations. And you would be surprised, or you might be surprised, that the ones that have all of this money swirling around them, they have the same questions as the ones who are just beginning. It doesn't mean you have more money, you have more answers.
No, more money, more problems, right?
Yeah. What's your takeaway?
My takeaway is this is a real opportunity, and both the funders and the grantees have responsibility in ensuring sustainability here, right? There are going to be some equity advances, and we want to make sure that they stick. So
I like that. They should stick.
Yeah. So.
All right. Well, that was a great introduction to equity and philanthropy. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. My little one's coming down the stairs, so I got to sign off before it gets loud.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye, everyone.